For thousands of years, the sea has been both a gateway to unimaginable riches and a graveyard for the boldest explorers. Picture this: you're standing on the deck of a wooden ship, salt spray stinging your face as the horizon stretches endlessly before you. In this vast, unpredictable wilderness, ancient sailors didn't just navigate by stars and currents. They relied on something far more mysterious: whispers of mermaids luring ships to their doom, storms summoned by whistling sailors, and the terrifying curse of the Albatross. These weren't just stories. They were deeply held beliefs that decided the fate of entire fleets, turned the tide of naval battles, and shaped the routes of global trade. From the Mediterranean to the South China Sea, every culture that dared to cross the waves carried its own superstitions like precious cargo. Some saw dolphins as divine protectors, while others feared red-headed passengers would bring disaster. Captains refused to set sail on certain days, crews threw coins into the sea to appease its wrath, and the mere sight of a woman on board could spark panic. But these rituals weren't just quirks of the past. They were survival tactics born from generations of watching the sea's merciless whims. When a single storm could erase months of planning, sailors clung to any sign, any ritual that might tip the scales in their favor. Today, we're unraveling 30 of these ancient maritime superstitions, beliefs so powerful they redirected trade routes, delayed wars, and even inspired mutinies. You'll discover why Roman generals sacrificed goats before naval battles, how Viking sailors charmed the wind, and the eerie origins of the phrase, "between the devil and the deep blue sea." Some of these traditions linger even now, hidden in the routines of modern sailors. So whether you're a history buff, a lover of folklore, or just someone who's ever felt the pull of the ocean's mystery, this voyage into the past will change how you see the sea forever. The water remembers its old legends. Let's uncover them together. Whistling on board a ship wasn't just a harmless pastime. It was an act that could summon catastrophe. Ancient sailors believed the sound of a human whistle mimicked the howling winds of a gathering storm, and to tempt the sea's fury was to invite disaster. Imagine a crew member absent-mindedly whistling a tune, only for the skies to darken and waves to rise in response. This superstition ran so deep that captains enforced strict bans, punishing anyone who dared to whistle with extra chores or even confinement. The logic was simple: the sea demanded respect, and provoking its anger was unthinkable. But this fear wasn't just about superstition, it had roots in practical observation. Sailors noticed how sudden gusts often followed strange sounds, linking whistling to unpredictable weather. Without modern forecasting, they relied on patterns, and this connection stuck. Even legendary naval commanders like Admiral Nelson reportedly forbade whistling on their ships, fearing it would upset the delicate balance between man and nature. The taboo persisted across cultures. Scandinavian sailors believed whistling could summon the mythical kraken, while Mediterranean traders thought it angered Poseidon himself. And though we now understand meteorology, traces of this dread linger. Some modern fishing crews and yacht captains still avoid whistling out of habit, or perhaps just in case. After all, when the sea has humbled the mightiest empires, why tempt fate? For centuries, women on ships were considered harbingers of disaster, a superstition so pervasive it shaped naval policies across the globe. Sailors whispered that a woman's presence would distract the crew, provoking jealousy among the men and, worse, angering the sea itself. The ocean was a masculine domain, unpredictable and violent, and women were seen as intruders who disrupted its delicate balance. Some believed storms would follow a female passenger like a curse, or that ships carrying women were doomed to sink. This fear ran so deep that many captains refused to let women step aboard, even in emergencies. Yet this taboo wasn't just about bad luck, it often masked deeper anxieties. Life at sea was harsh and isolating, and superstitions became a way to explain the unexplainable. If a ship vanished in a storm, blaming a stowaway woman was easier than admitting the sea was uncontrollable. In some cases, the myth served as a convenient scapegoat for poor leadership or rotten supplies. After all, it's no coincidence that the "women bring misfortune" belief flourished in eras when ships were poorly built and navigation was guesswork. But here's the fascinating twist: not all cultures saw women as curses. Many ancient seafaring societies revered female figures as protectors of sailors. The Phoenicians carved goddess Astarte's image onto their prows for safe passage, while Norse legends spoke of mermaid-like spirits guiding ships through fog. Even the figureheads adorning European vessels, often bare-breasted women, were believed to calm the waves with their beauty. Some pirates, like Anne Bonny and Mary Read, famously defied the superstition altogether, proving women could command respect on the open ocean. So why the contradiction? Because superstitions are rarely just about logic. They reflect the fears and power structures of their time. Where women were excluded from maritime life, myths painted them as dangers. Where they held spiritual or social influence, they became guardians. The sea didn't care about gender, but human societies did. And in the end, these beliefs reveal less about the ocean's whims and more about the sailors who tried to make sense of them. Few creatures carried as much superstition as the albatross, a bird that could mean salvation or doom depending on how sailors treated it. With wingspans stretching wider than a man's height, these majestic birds were seen as more than just animals. They were omens, spirits, even the reincarnated souls of drowned sailors. To ancient mariners, an albatross circling a ship wasn't just a sighting, it was a message. Some believed the birds carried the souls of lost crewmates, guiding vessels safely through fog. Others whispered that their appearance foretold violent storms, as if the birds themselves summoned the winds they rode. The most infamous legend comes from Samuel Taylor Coleridge's poem The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, where a sailor's thoughtless killing of an albatross brings a curse upon his ship. Calm seas, rotting food, and ghostly vengeance. But long before Coleridge penned those lines, sailors already treated the birds with reverence. Antarctic whalers spoke of albatrosses leading them to prey, while Polynesian navigators saw them as divine messengers. Harming one wasn't just bad luck, it was an affront to the sea itself. Yet this superstition had roots in practicality. Albatrosses thrive in rough, open waters, so their presence often signaled land was near or that treacherous weather was coming. Sailors who ignored their patterns risked disaster. The birds became living barometers, their behavior studied as closely as the stars, and because they could glide for days without rest, some cultures believed they carried supernatural stamina, a gift the sea might revoke if humans interfered. The consequences of defying this belief were no myth. Historical logs tell of crews mutinying after an officer shot an albatross, convinced the act doomed their voyage. Some captains enforced rituals to honor the birds, like tossing scraps overboard to pay tribute or carving their likenesses into ship rails for protection. Even today, modern sailors in the Southern Ocean report a strange reluctance to disturb albatrosses, not out of fear, perhaps, but from an old, unshakable respect. What's fascinating is how this superstition blurred the line between reverence and fear. The albatross wasn't just a warning, it was a test. Treat it kindly, and it might guide you home. Cross it, and the sea itself would turn against you. In a world where nature's whims decided life or death, sailors didn't just believe in signs, they depended on them. And in the Albatross, they found both a guardian and a judge. Red skies at dawn sent chills down the spines of ancient sailors, not because of their beauty, but because of what they foreshadowed. That vivid crimson glow on the horizon wasn't just a picturesque sunrise. It was nature's alarm bell, a silent scream warning of storms ahead. The rhyme, red sky at morning, sailors take warning. Red sky at night, sailors delight, wasn't just folklore, it was a lifeline, passed down through generations of mariners who had no satellites or radar to rely on. The science behind this superstition is surprisingly sound. A red sky at dawn occurs when sunlight scatters through moisture-laden particles in the atmosphere, often indicating an approaching low-pressure system, the precursor to storms in many coastal regions. Sailors in the Mediterranean noticed this pattern centuries ago, linking the fiery hues to the fierce winds that would follow. Greek and Phoenician traders timed their voyages around these ruddy warnings, while Viking navigators carved the proverb into runestones as a reminder to younger crews. Even the Bible mentions it in the book of Matthew, proof of how deeply this observation was woven into seafaring cultures. But the red sky's power went beyond mere weather prediction, it shaped empires. Historical records show entire naval campaigns delayed because of a blood-red dawn. In 1588, Spanish Armada captains hesitated to engage the English after several mornings of ominous crimson skies, a delay that may have contributed to their eventual defeat. Whaling ships in the 1800s would turn back to port at the sight of it, abandoning lucrative hunts to avoid being caught in a tempest. The superstition was so ingrained that some captains kept sky watchers aboard solely to monitor the colors of sunrise and sunset. What's fascinating is how this belief bridged the gap between myth and meteorology. While sailors didn't understand the physics of light scattering, they recognized the pattern through brutal experience. A single red morning could mean the difference between a successful trade run and a shipwreck, so they treated the sky's palette with the gravity of a divine message. Even today, modern sailors armed with Doppler radar and GPS still glance at the dawn out of habit, a nod to the ancestors who taught them to read the heavens like a map. The endurance of this superstition speaks to something deeper than weather prediction. It's about humanity's relentless quest to find order in chaos, to decode nature's signals when faced with the unimaginable power of the sea. The red sky didn't just warn sailors of storms, it reminded them that the ocean was a force to be respected, never conquered, and in that humility lay their survival. Few superstitions were as bizarre or as widespread as the dreaded banana curse. From the Caribbean to the South Pacific, sailors treated bananas like poison, refusing to let them aboard their ships. Pirates especially feared them, convinced that a single bunch could doom an entire voyage with rotten luck. Ships carrying bananas were said to vanish without a trace, crews would fall mysteriously ill, and storms would rise from calm seas as if summoned by the fruit itself. Even the most hardened captains would rather face a naval battle than risk a crate of bananas in their hold. But where did this irrational fear come from? One theory points to a very real danger hiding in banana shipments: deadly spiders. In the 1800s, sailors unloading bananas in tropical ports often encountered venomous spiders like the Brazilian wandering spider, which lurked in the bunches. A single bite could kill a man in hours, and with no antivenom available, the only cure was superstition. Rather than admit they were helpless against nature's smaller predators, sailors spun tales of cursed fruit, turning a biological hazard into a supernatural one. Another explanation ties the banana taboo to chemistry. Bananas release ethylene gas as they ripen, speeding up the decay of other fruits and vegetables stored nearby. On long voyages, spoiled food meant starvation, so crews blamed the bananas rather than understanding the science behind the spoilage. Some logs even describe sailors throwing entire shipments overboard after noticing their other provisions rotting unusually fast, a desperate act that only reinforced the myth. Yet the most chilling stories involve entire crews disappearing. In the 1700s, the British merchant ship HMS Mignonet reportedly carried a large shipment of bananas when it vanished in the Atlantic. When wreckage washed ashore months later, people whispered that the curse had taken the men. Similar tales spread through pirate havens, where veterans claimed banana-laden ships were more likely to run aground or suffer mutinies. Whether coincidence or collective hysteria, the fear became so ingrained that some naval contracts explicitly banned bananas from being loaded. What's fascinating is how this superstition outlived its origins. Even after refrigeration and pest control made bananas safer, many sailors still avoided them well into the 20th century. Modern cargo ships sometimes joke about the banana curse as a harmless tradition, but the unease lingers, a testament to how deeply terror can embed itself in maritime culture. After all, when the sea is your only home, you don't tempt fate, and if that means sacrificing a tropical fruit, most sailors would say it's a small price to pay. Crossing the equator wasn't just a navigational milestone, it was a trial by fire, a bizarre and often brutal ceremony that tested sailors' mettle while binding crews together. Picture a sweltering deck, the sun blazing overhead as seasoned sailors smear a terrified newcomer with rancid grease, dunk him in a makeshift ocean of filthy water, and declare him reborn under the watchful eye of King Neptune. This wasn't hazing, it was a sacred rite, a tradition so entrenched that even the most disciplined naval fleets tolerated its chaos. The ritual, known as the line crossing ceremony, dates back to at least the 1500s, when European ships began regularly traversing the equator. Sailors believed the ocean was ruled by Neptune, the Roman god of the sea, and crossing into his domain without paying homage invited disaster. Storms, becalmed waters, or even vanishing ships were blamed on disrespecting this aquatic sovereign. To appease him, polywogs, sailors crossing the equator for the first time, were subjected to a series of humiliating trials designed to prove their worth. The details varied by ship and era, but the core elements remained strikingly similar. Seasoned sailors, dubbed shellbacks, would dress as Neptune and his court, complete with tridents and seaweed crowns. Polywogs might be forced to kiss a fish, endure mock trials for imaginary crimes, or crawl through barrels of rotting food, the climax being dragged through a pool of seawater, often mixed with whatever foul substances the crew could spare, before emerging as trusted shellbacks. Some logs describe sailors being lathered in axle grease or even soot, then shaved with wooden razors in a grotesque parody of a barber's visit. But beneath the absurdity lay a calculated purpose. These rituals weren't just about superstition, they were psychological tools. Long voyages strained morale with cramped quarters, monotony, and the ever-present threat of scurvy or mutiny. The ceremony broke the tension, giving crews a shared experience and a pecking order. A sailor who endured the humiliation could laugh about it later, bonding with the very crewmates who'd tormented him. It was a twisted sort of teamwork, a way to transform green recruits into hardened seamen. Naval records reveal how seriously this tradition was taken. In 1824, a British sailor aboard the HMS Blonde died during an exceptionally violent initiation, prompting the Admiralty to issue guidelines not to ban the practice, but to curb its excesses. Even Christopher Columbus's crew likely performed a version of the ritual, though details are lost to time. The U.S. Navy still acknowledges the ceremony today, albeit in a far tamer form, with certificates awarded to those who have crossed the line. What's fascinating is how the ritual straddled the line between fear and farce. Sailors genuinely believed Neptune's wrath was real, but they also reveled in the chaos of the ceremony. It was a rare moment when the rigid hierarchy of ship life flipped, allowing low-ranking crewmen to mock their superiors so long as those superiors hadn't yet earned their shellback status. The Equator wasn't just a geographic boundary. It was a threshold between the known and the unknown, and surviving its trials meant you belonged to the sea's secret fraternity. The endurance of this tradition speaks to something primal in maritime culture. The ocean doesn't care about human rank or resumes. It tests everyone equally. By facing Neptune's court, sailors proved they respected that truth and earned the right to call themselves true seafarers. Even now, centuries later, the echoes of those raucous ceremonies linger, a reminder that the sea's mysteries aren't just in its depths, but in the rituals of those who dare to cross them. For sailors staring down the barrel of a storm or the teeth of enemy cannons, the promise of Fiddler's Green was a lifeline, not just a myth, but a desperately needed vision of peace. Imagine an endless meadow where the sun never burns too hot, the ale never runs dry, and the music never stops. No rotting timbers, no scurvy, no whip-cracking officers, just a perpetual dance under open skies. This wasn't the gloomy Davy Jones locker where drowned souls languished in the deep. Fiddler's Green was a sailor's heaven, tailor-made for men who'd spent lifetimes braving the ocean's cruelty. The legend flourished among 18th and 19th century mariners, particularly British and American crews. Unlike formal religious afterlives with their judgment and penance, Fiddler's Green was democratic. Any sailor who'd logged enough sea miles, some said 50 years, others just one voyage, could earn a spot. The criteria were delightfully vague, reflecting the anarchic spirit of ship life. Pirates whispered about it in taverns, whalers described it during long night watches, and naval recruits clung to it during their first battles. Even the name hinted at its appeal: Fiddler for the ceaseless music, Green for the lush land they'd rarely seen. What's striking is how this myth mirrored sailors' deepest longings. Life at sea was a grueling cycle of salt rations, cramped quarters, and back-breaking labor. Fiddler's Green inverted every hardship. Instead of stale biscuits, roast beef and peaches. Instead of floggings, fiddle tunes and laughter. Some versions even included sweethearts waiting ashore, a poignant detail for men who'd spent years without touching dry land. This wasn't just escapism, it was a psychological survival tool. Facing storms that could swallow ships whole, crews needed to believe their suffering had a reward. The afterlife's geography shifted with the telling. Some placed it on a hidden island, others beyond the western horizon where the sun dipped into the sea. A few logs describe it as a floating paradise drifting just out of sight like a mirage. The inconsistency didn't matter. What counted was the certainty that somewhere the sea's grip finally loosened. Even battle-hardened captains indulged the fantasy. Admiral Nelson reportedly told his men that fallen sailors would feast in Fiddler's Green, a morale booster before Trafalgar. But here's the twist: the myth may have roots in real places. Caribbean sailors spoke of a lush valley in the Azores where ships sometimes anchored to resupply. After months of salted meat and weevilly bread, the fresh fruit and green hills must have felt supernatural. Other theories tie it to Celtic folklores, Tyr na and Og, an eternal youth-filled land across the waves. Whatever its origins, Fiddler's Green became a shared anchor for hope. When the Essex whale ship sank in 1820, survivors clinging to lifeboats whispered about it to stave off despair. The legend's legacy lingers in surprising ways. Modern naval cadets sometimes reference fiddlers green in toasts, and the term appears in sea shanties and novels like Patrick O'Brian's Aubrey Maturin series. It's a reminder that sailors didn't just fear death, they reimagined it. In a world where the ocean showed no mercy, they dreamed up a place where it finally, blessedly, let go. And perhaps that's why the myth endures, not as folklore, but as a testament to the resilience of men who turned the terror of the deep into a story worth sailing toward. Friday wasn't just another day of the week for sailors, it was a date etched in dread, a silent alarm that sent seasoned captains scrambling to delay voyages. The mere suggestion of launching a ship on Friday could spark mutinous whispers among crews, with men crossing themselves or outright refusing to board. And if that Friday happened to fall on the 13th of the month, that was more than bad luck. It was an open invitation for disaster. Ships that dared to depart on this cursed day were said to vanish into storms, spring inexplicable leaks, or become plagued by phantom fires below deck. Even naval commanders with the backing of kings hesitated to challenge this superstition, knowing morale could crumble before the ship left sight of land. The roots of this fear run deep into Christian tradition. Friday marked the day of Christ's crucifixion, a moment of profound sorrow and divine sacrifice. For medieval sailors, many of whom carried rosaries and prayed to saints for protection, setting sail on this day felt like spitting in the face of providence. Some legends claimed Noah's flood began on a Friday, or that the Tower of Babel's collapse occurred on the same ill-fated day. By the time European explorers were charting the New World, the taboo had hardened into doctrine. Christopher Columbus himself wrote in his logs about delaying departures to avoid Friday sailings despite pressure from sponsors, but the terror of Friday the 13th was uniquely maritime. While landlubbers might shrug off the date as mildly unlucky, sailors saw it as a death sentence written in the stars. Whaling logs from the 1800s describe crews bribing officers to postpone voyages when the calendar aligned just wrong. In 1869, the clipper ship Water, which famously defied the superstition, departing on Friday the 13th, only to disappear without a trace off the Cape of Good Hope. When wreckage washed ashore months later, the newspapers declared it proof of the curse's power. What's fascinating is how this belief persisted even among rational men. Naval records show that by the late 19th century, marine insurance companies quietly charged higher premiums for voyages beginning on Fridays, a nod to the statistical spike in accidents. Whether coincidence or self-fulfilling prophecy, the data seemed to confirm the myth. Crews expecting disaster might panic at minor malfunctions, or captains might take reckless risks to prove the superstition wrong. The fear became its own kind of storm, swirling in the minds of men already facing the ocean's wrath. Yet there were always dissenters. The British Royal Navy, known for its discipline, occasionally staged Friday launches to break what admirals called childish thinking. In 1807, the HMS Friday was commissioned specifically to mock the superstition, complete with a captain named Friday. The ship served without incident for decades, though sailors still avoided mentioning its name in port. Even pirates, those notorious risk-takers, had their contradictions. Blackbeard's fleet reportedly avoided Friday departures, while Calico Jack's crew flaunted them, wearing red on the 13th as a dare to the universe. The superstition's shadow stretches into modern times. Aircraft carriers and cruise ships still avoid scheduling major events on Friday the 13th when possible, and some commercial fishermen won't set nets that day. It's less about belief now and more about tradition, a nod to the generations of sailors who treated the ocean not just as a workplace, but as a living force with fickle rules. In the end, the Friday taboo reveals a timeless truth about the sea. When survival hinges on factors beyond human control, even the strongest minds will cling to rituals that promise a sliver of safety. And sometimes, whether by chance or something stranger, the sea seems to listen. A ship's cat was more than a furry pest controller. It was a living barometer, a guardian against the unseen, and sometimes the only thing standing between a crew and disaster. Sailors didn't just tolerate these feline crewmates, they revered them, studying their every twitch and purr like oracle signs. When a cat meticulously washed its face, crews relaxed, knowing calm seas lay ahead. But if it paced the decks with its tail puffed or hissed at empty corners, even the bravest sailors would exchange nervous glances. The ocean was full of invisible threats, and cats, with their uncanny senses, were believed to sniff them out long before humans could. This superstition wasn't just whimsy, it was survival. Rats carried disease, chewed through ropes, and spoiled precious food stores, so cats earned their keep as hunters. But their role as spiritual protectors ran deeper. Norse legends claimed cats could see wind spirits, their twitching ears detecting gusts hours before they hit. Mediterranean sailors believed a black cat's presence warded off the evil eye, while Japanese fishermen thought a tortoiseshell cat could charm storms into submission. Some captains refused to set sail without a cat aboard, and tales spread of ships sinking shortly after their feline mascot mysteriously vanished. The Mary Celeste, famously found adrift in 1872 with no crew, was noted for one eerie detail: her cat was also missing. The bond between sailors and their cats often bordered on sacred. Ships' logs detail crews pooling their meager wages to buy fresh fish for favored mousers, or crafting tiny life vests for them during storms. When a cat died, some captains held full burials at sea, complete with eulogies, a stark contrast to the way human casualties were often hastily committed to the deep. The loss was more than practical, it was an omen. After the battleship HMS Prince of Wales sank in 1941, survivors swore their ship's cat, Blackie, had been acting strangely for days, as if trying to warn them. Yet not all seafaring cultures shared this reverence. Some Pacific Islanders viewed cats as bad luck, associating them with sorcery. Pirates, too, had their contradictions. While many cherished cats, Edward Teach, better known as Blackbeard, reportedly kept a kitten solely to throw overboard when he needed to summon a storm. But these exceptions only highlight how widespread the belief was. For most sailors, a cat's intuition was as vital as a compass. Even today, modern cargo ships occasionally carry cats out of tradition, though now it's more for companionship than cosmic guidance. What's remarkable is how this superstition blurred the line between instinct and mysticism. Cats really do sense shifts in air pressure, explaining their storm-predicting antics. Their aversion to certain spaces might have been due to rats or rot humans couldn't yet smell, but sailors didn't need science to justify their trust. They'd seen the proof in 1,000 narrow escapes. In a world where the next gust could be a breeze or a hurricane, the ship's cat wasn't just a pet. It was a tiny, whiskered lifeline to forces no human could control. And sometimes that made all the difference. Few superstitions carried as much weight or as much cruelty as the dreaded Jonah Effect, named after the biblical prophet whose disobedience supposedly summoned a storm that nearly sank his ship. A Jonah was any crewmate believed to be a magnet for misfortune. It didn't matter if the bad luck was real or imagined. A snapped rope, a sudden squall, or even a spoiled meal could be enough to mark a man as cursed. Once branded a Jonah, his fate was sealed. Crews would whisper behind his back, captains would sideline him from crucial tasks, and at the next port, he'd be left ashore with nothing but the clothes on his back. Mercy had no place in maritime law when the sea itself seemed to demand sacrifice. The fear ran deepest in whaling and merchant crews, where voyages stretched for years and survival hinged on every hand pulling their weight. Logs from the 1800s tell of cooks blamed for rotten provisions, deckhands accused of jinxing the wind, and even officers ostracized after multiple ships under their command met disaster. In 1834, the Nantucket whaler Essex, no relation to the more famous tragedy, reportedly marooned a young sailor in the Azores after 3 consecutive whale hunts failed. The captain's journal simply noted, "The Jonah is gone, the men breathe easier." But what's chilling is how arbitrary the designation could be. Sometimes it fell on the socially awkward, the man who talked too much or too little. Other times it targeted the unlucky. One sailor on the British clipper Cutty Sark was labeled a Jonah after surviving 2 shipwrecks in a year. Superstition dictated that disaster followed him like a shadow, and his crewmates refused to sleep in hammocks near his. By the time they reached Shanghai, he chose to desert, though logs hint he was given no choice at all. The parallels to the biblical story were no accident. Just as Jonah's shipmates threw him overboard to calm the storm, real-life crews saw exile as their only salvation. The sea was a harsh, irrational judge, and sailors believed it demanded harsh solutions. Some captains staged sham trials to legitimize the banishment, complete with evidence like the Jonah's birthplace Friday-born men were suspect or odd habits. One 19th-century naval surgeon recorded a case where a sailor's recurring nightmares of sinking were taken as prophetic, proof he was summoning the very doom he feared. Yet the Jonah myth wasn't just about blame, it was about control. In a world where storms could appear without warning and ships vanish without trace, superstitions offered a twisted logic. If misfortune had a human face, it could be cast away, and if the next voyage succeeded, that proved the crew had been right. The cycle fed itself, with each banished Jonah reinforcing the belief. Not all cultures bought into the idea. Polynesian navigators, for instance, believed bad luck stemmed from broken taboos, not individuals. But in European and American sailing traditions, the Jonah Effect endured well into the age of steam. Even the Titanic survivors sparked whispers when it was noted that one crewman had served on 2 other ships that sank, a Jonah who'd somehow slipped through the cracks. The legacy of this superstition is a dark reminder of how fear can warp human judgment. When survival feels precarious, people will grasp at any explanation, even one that sacrifices the innocent. The sea didn't need Jonahs to be dangerous, but sailors needed someone to blame, and in that desperation, they became as merciless as the waves themselves. Before a ship ever touched the waves, its builders performed a sacred ritual, one that bridged the gap between craftsmanship and communion with the divine. As the mast was lowered into place, a single coin would be pressed into the keel, hidden beneath layers of timber where no eye would ever see it again. This wasn't just tradition, it was a toll paid to the gods of the deep, a silent plea for mercy in waters that showed none. From the triremes of ancient Greece to the galleons of the Spanish Main, this practice spanned centuries and continents, a universal language of reverence among those who knew the sea's wrath firsthand. The choice of coin was never random. Roman shipwrights used silver denarii stamped with Neptune's likeness, believing the god would recognize his own image and grant protection. Viking longships often bore Arabic dirhams or Byzantine solidus coins, tributes to foreign deities whose realms their voyages might cross. In China, sailors tucked lucky cash with square holes beneath their masts, symbolizing the union of heaven and earth. Each culture adapted the ritual, but the core belief remained. The sea demanded payment upfront, and those who skimped would pay dearly later. Archaeology has proven this wasn't just myth. When the Vasa, Sweden's infamous warship, was raised from Stockholm's harbor in 1961, conservators found 12 coins meticulously placed under its mainmast, one for each disciple, echoing Christian prayers for divine intervention. Similarly, the wreck of the Mary Rose, Henry VIII's flagship, yielded a gold angel coin beneath its foremast, likely placed there as both offering and charm. These weren't casual gestures, they were calculated acts of spiritual insurance, as vital to a ship's survival as its hull or sails. But why under the mast? The answer lies in the physics of sailing. A mast is the spine of a ship, the pivot point where wind and wave forces converge. Ancient builders understood this intuitively. If the sea wanted to break a vessel, it would start here. By embedding a coin at this critical junction, they symbolically anchored the ship to divine favor, creating a metaphysical failsafe against the elements. Some cultures took it further, whispering prayers into the coin's metal before sealing it away, as if trapping the word's power within the wood. The ritual's parallels to burial customs are impossible to ignore. Just as coins were placed on the eyes of the dead to pay charon for passage to the afterlife, ship coins served as fares for safe transit across the living ocean. This connection wasn't lost on sailors, who often spoke of ships as having souls. A vessel launched without its hidden tribute was considered unblessed, a ghost ship in waiting. Whispers followed such ships from port to port, with crews swapping stories of strange groans in their timbers or unnatural rolls in calm seas. Perhaps the most poignant aspect of this tradition is how it democratized danger. Kings and commoners alike participated, whether it was a Phoenician merchant pressing a humble copper piece into his fishing boat or Queen Elizabeth's shipwrights embedding gold nobles into warships. The sea didn't care about rank. It could drown a pauper or monarch with equal indifference. That coin under the mast was the great equalizer, a silent acknowledgement that everyone, from deckhand to admiral, was at the mercy of forces beyond human control. Modern shipbuilders occasionally revive the practice as a nod to history, though now it's more ceremony than conviction. But for ancient sailors, that hidden coin was as real as the mast above it, a tiny metal prayer holding back the abyss. In a world without lifeboats or weather forecasts, sometimes faith was the only lifeline they had, and if that meant sacrificing a day's wages to the depths. Most would say it was the cheapest insurance they'd ever buy. No ghost ship haunted sailors' nightmares more fiercely than the Flying Dutchman, a phantom vessel cursed to roam the waves for eternity, its tattered sails glowing against the night like a funeral shroud. Spotting this specter wasn't just bad luck, it was a death sentence, a sign that the sea had marked your ship for its next tragedy. The legend twisted through centuries of maritime lore, from Dutch East India Company logs to the feverish whispers of Cape Horn sailors who swore they'd seen its crimson sails vanish into fog. But behind the terror lay something stranger, a collision of human fear and the ocean's uncanny ability to deceive even the sharpest eyes. The earliest accounts date to the 17th century, when a Dutch captain named Hendrik van der Decken allegedly swore he'd round the Cape of Good Hope even if it took until Judgment Day. For his blasphemy, the story goes, he was condemned to sail forever, his crew reduced to skeletal wraiths. But the myth likely sprouted from real phenomena, the same mirages and light distortions that still baffle modern sailors. In certain conditions, temperature inversions can bend light, making distant ships appear to float above the horizon or warp into impossible shapes. A merchant vessel glimpsed through sea fog might suddenly seem to hover, its hull obscured, leaving only ghostly rigging visible. Combine that with sleep-deprived crews and the stress of months at sea, and it's no wonder the Dutchman's legend took root. What's chilling is how consistently the sightings align. Sailors across eras described the same details: a ship moving against the wind, its rigging glowing with unnatural light, sometimes accompanied by the sound of bells or distant screams. In 1835, the British frigate HMS Bacchante logged an encounter off Australia, with midshipmen reporting a phantom ship that dissolved as they approached. Even King George V, then a young naval officer, claimed to have seen it, writing in his diary of a strange red light that vanished without explanation. These weren't just drunk or delirious men, they were trained observers, yet the sea fooled them all. The Dutchman's curse seeped into naval strategy. During the Napoleonic Wars, British captains avoided certain routes after rumors spread that the Phantom targeted wartime ships. Whalers in the 1800s would change course at the mere hint of its silhouette, abandoning lucrative hunting grounds to outrun the omen. The superstition grew so potent that some crews mutinied rather than sail through Dutchman's waters, stretches of ocean where sightings clustered. And when the SS Waratah vanished off South Africa in 1909 with 211 souls, newspapers blamed the Dutchman, citing passengers who'd claimed to see a blood-red ship trailing them days earlier. Yet the legend's power wasn't just about fear. It also served as a warning against hubris. Vanderdecken's sin wasn't just swearing, it was defying nature's limits, a lesson every sailor knew intimately. The sea tolerated no arrogance, and the Dutchman became its enforcer, a reminder that no matter how advanced ships became, the ocean would always have the final say. That's why the myth outlasted the age of sail. Modern container crews still joke uneasily about Dutchman weather when fog rolls in, and the name lingers in naval slang for any doomed enterprise. Science now explains the mirages, but some mysteries resist unraveling. In 2012, a research vessel off Namibia captured thermal footage of a ship-shaped heat blur that matched no known traffic. The crew, all rational scientists, admitted a shiver of recognition. Perhaps that's the Dutchman's true legacy, not as a ghost but as a mirror. In its endless voyage, we see our own fragility reflected. The gnawing knowledge that for all our technology, the sea remains a realm where reality bends, and not every shadow stays where it should. The stillness of a windless sea could be more terrifying than any storm, because in that eerie quiet, sailors believed the drowned stirred. One wrong sound, one careless clang of the ship's bell, and you might wake what should have stayed sleeping. This superstition ran so deep that crews would stuff rags into bells to muffle accidental rings, and captains enforced strict silence during calms. To their minds, the bell wasn't just a timekeeper, it was a beacon, its vibrations cutting through the barrier between the living and the lost. The logic was chillingly simple. Calm waters mirrored death's stillness, a blank canvas where the drowned could hear echoes from the world above. Ringing the bell in such conditions was like knocking on death's door, an invitation for spirits to climb aboard. Whalers in the 1800s told of phantom hands gripping the rails after a midnight bell toll, while Mediterranean fishermen swore they'd seen pale faces rise with the tide when metal struck metal. The fear wasn't confined to one culture. Japanese sailors avoided temple bells at sea for the same reason, and Norse sagas warned that the bell's clang could summon the Draugr, corpses bloated with seawater and rage. But this taboo wasn't just about ghosts, it was about acoustics. In dead calm, sound travels freakishly far over water, a phenomenon sailors couldn't explain but instinctively feared. A bell's ring might carry for miles, distorting as it went until it resembled a human scream. Sleep-deprived crews, already jumpy from weeks at sea, would hear these echoes and mistake them for voices. Logs from the clipper ship Cutty Sark describe a mate punished for polishing the bell during a calm, only for the crew to later swear they heard whispering in the rigging, voices calling names from the ship's muster roll of the dead. The ritual silence also served a practical purpose. Calms were critical moments for repairs and navigation checks, and unnecessary noise distracted from the subtle sounds of leaking timbers or approaching squalls. By framing the quiet as supernatural law, captains ensured focus when it mattered most. Even pirates, hardly known for discipline, adhered to this rule. Black Bart Roberts' articles expressly forbade bell ringing in calms, punishable by marooning, a fate worse than ghosts to most sea rogues, yet the bell's power wasn't all doom. In storms, crews rang it fervently, believing the opposite, that its peals could repel spirits, clearing a path through the chaos. The same instrument that summoned the dead in calm could save the living in gales. This duality reveals the sailor's deepest truth. The sea was a realm of contradictions, where every tool could be a talisman or a curse, depending on how the waves chose to behave. Modern ships still carry bells, though now they're largely ceremonial, but on vintage tall ships and in some fishing fleets, the old wariness lingers. Crews might laugh about it over drinks in port, but when the water goes glassy and the air hangs thick, you'll rarely hear a single, unscripted ring. Some instincts outlast their explanations, and when you're floating atop centuries of drowned souls, silence isn't just tradition, it's survival. Among the most macabre pirate charms, none chilled the blood quite like the Hand of Glory, a severed human hand, often pickled or dried, carried as both weapon and ward. This wasn't mere trophy-taking, it was a calculated fusion of terror and occult belief. Pirates who clutched these grim relics swore they could render ships invisible under the noses of naval patrols or paralyze enemy crews with supernatural dread. The logic was as twisted as it was effective. If fear won battles before a single shot was fired, why not weaponize the darkest corners of superstition? The practice traced back to European folklore, where the Hand of Glory originally referred to the severed hand of a hanged man, cured with salt and fat from the same corpse. Candles made from its fingers were said to plunge rooms into darkness for everyone but the holder, a thief's perfect tool. But pirates adapted the myth for the high seas, where the stakes were higher and the audience more impressionable. Blackbeard's crew reportedly kept a shriveled hand in a jar of brine, displaying it before boarding actions to sap opponents' will. Other accounts describe French corsairs nailing hands to their masts as storm deflectors, believing the digits would point toward safe passage even in zero visibility. What's fascinating is how this superstition straddled the line between magic and theater. Many pirates were pragmatists who understood the power of psychological warfare. A ship flying a black flag was threatening, but one whose crew waved a decaying hand. That was the stuff of nightmares. Merchant logs from the Caribbean tell of crews surrendering without resistance after glimpsing these talismans, convinced they were hexed. The hand's reputation grew so potent that some pirates faked them, using animal bones or wax molds to exploit the legend. Yet for some, the belief ran deeper than bluff. The notorious buccaneer Francois L'Olonais allegedly slept with a Hand of Glory beneath his pillow, convinced it granted him visions of enemy movements. When his own hand was later severed in battle, his crew preserved it, believing its power had transferred to them. Such stories reveal the desperation beneath the bravado. Pirates lived brutal, short lives. If a grisly charm offered even illusory control over fate, many would cling to it. Archaeology hints at how widespread the practice was. Excavations of pirate haunts like Port Royal have uncovered small, lead-lined boxes perfect for storing salted hands away from prying eyes. And in 2018, divers off Madagascar found a brass-bound chest containing a single mummified hand, its fingers curled as if grasping something invisible. Whether it was ever used to terrify victims or calm storms, we'll never know. But its very existence proves how deeply pirates believed in the sea's supernatural economy, where power could be bottled in bone and sinew. The Hand of Glory's legacy lingers in maritime slang. To show someone the hand still means to intimidate, and Dead Men's Pointers refers to reckless navigation, a nod to the myth that these hands could guide ships through impossible straits. Modern sailors might scoff at the superstition, but few would volunteer to test its power. After all, the ocean remains a place where logic falters and old fears die hard. And perhaps that was the charm's real magic, not invisibility, but the unshakable certainty that somewhere in the dark, the past still has its grip on us. The moon's pull wasn't just a force of nature to sailors, it was a capricious god, capable of warping tides and minds. When the full moon hung heavy over the mast, seasoned crews would eye each other warily, watching for signs of the lunacy they believed the lunar glow could trigger. The term lunatic itself comes from the Latin luna, reflecting an ancient conviction that the moon's phases twisted human sanity like the tides. Ships' logs overflow with accounts of men who'd seemingly lost their wits under the full moon fighting invisible foes, weeping over trivial slights, or even leaping overboard, convinced the silver path on the water led home. This superstition wasn't pure fantasy. The moon's gravitational tug does drive the tides, a fact sailors observed long before science explained it. But they took the connection further, believing what governed the ocean's rhythms must also rule human tempers. Mediterranean captains avoided launching voyages during the full moon, fearing crews would turn moonstruck mid-journey. Whalers in the Arctic noted how harpooners made reckless throws under its light, while Caribbean pirates timed raids to the new moon when darkness hid their approach and kept their men's aggression in check. Even naval surgeons kept lunar calendars, prescribing stricter discipline or extra rations of calming teas when the moon waxed full. The moon's influence seeped into maritime language and ritual. Moonraker became slang for a fool, inspired by tales of sailors trying to rake the moon's reflection from the sea. Some crews tied knots in ropes during full moons, a symbolic gesture to bind their own unraveling nerves. Others whispered that sleeping with moonlight on your face would summon nightmares of drowning. A warning still echoed in modern fishing communities. The Essex whale ship's survivors, adrift after their infamous sinking, reported hallucinations of ghostly moons guiding them toward non-existent islands. Whether exhaustion or lunar madness caused these visions, the survivors believed the latter. Yet the moon wasn't always an enemy. Polynesian navigators revered it as a guide, using its position to chart courses across thousands of miles. Viking sagas tell of moon roads, glowing bands on the water said to lead to undiscovered lands. The duality captures the sea's own nature, both compass and capricious foe. Even today, fishermen debate the moon's role in fish behavior, and some yacht racers still schedule departures around its phases, not out of fear but habit. What's haunting is how the superstition outlasted its origins. Modern science confirms the moon affects tides, not mines, yet hospitals and police departments still brace for full moon chaos, and sailors joke about lunar luck. Perhaps it's human nature to blame the cosmos for our own unpredictability. Or perhaps, after centuries of watching the moon twist the sea into frenzy, sailors understood something primal. When you dance with forces that vast, it's hard not to feel a little unmoored yourself. When sailors faced storms that ripped sails and waves that swallowed horizons, they turned to the most sacred of messengers, the albatross. But it wasn't just the living bird they revered. Even in death, its bones held power. Across the Pacific and Southern Oceans, crews practiced a haunting ritual, carving prayers into the hollow bones of albatross wings, then casting them into the sea like letters to the gods. These bone letters weren't mere superstition, they were last hopes etched in calcium, fragile vessels carrying the raw terror of men who knew the ocean's indifference firsthand. The process was steeped in solemnity. After an albatross died, naturally killing one for this purpose would have been unthinkable. Its wing bones were carefully cleaned and dried. Using nails or knife points, sailors carved names, dates, or pleas like "fair winds" or "mercy" in cramped, shaky scripts. Some included sketches of ships or loved ones, as if the gods might recognize the faces behind the desperation. Then at dawn, the bone would be tossed into the waves with whispered invocations. The belief was starkly beautiful. The albatross, a creature that could glide for days without rest, would carry these pleas to the divine even in death. Whaling logs from the 1800s describe crews spending storm-lashed nights hunched over bones, their carvings growing more frantic as gales howled. One recovered bone, now in a New Zealand museum, bears the inscription, "Find my boy," next to a crude map of the English coast, likely a father's plea to guide his son home after years apart. Another, discovered on a Chilean beach in 2019, reads "Forgive us" in 3 languages, suggesting a multinational crew's shared guilt over some unrecorded sin. These weren't just messages, they were psychological lifelines, a way to cling to agency when the sea stripped it away. The ritual's roots trace back to Polynesian and Maori navigators, who viewed albatrosses as taniwha spiritual guardians. Early European sailors, witnessing their reverence, adapted the practice but twisted its meaning. Where indigenous cultures saw partnership with nature, desperate whalers and merchant crews saw bargaining chips. A bone cast overboard might buy a few more days of calm, or so they hoped. The darker irony, many of these same ships were hunting whales to near extinction, yet begged mercy from the wings of a bird they considered sacred. What makes these artifacts so poignant is their futility and their courage. We've found fewer than 24 intact bone letters, suggesting most were swallowed by the sea unread. But that wasn't the point. The act itself was the prayer, a defiance of despair. Modern oceanographers compare it to message in a bottle traditions, but with higher stakes. These weren't whimsical notes to strangers. They were confessions, apologies, and love letters hurled into the void by men who knew they might never see shore again. Today, the few surviving bones sit in maritime museums, their inscriptions faded but legible. They remind us that superstition wasn't just about fear, it was about humility. When the wind died and the food ran low, even the most hardened sailors admitted they weren't masters of the ocean. They were guests begging for safe passage from forces they'd never fully understand. And in those carved bones, we hear their voices across centuries, not as myths but as men. To receive the black spot was to feel your own mortality press against your skin like the barrel of a loaded pistol. This infamous pirate death warrant, a simple circle of paper blackened with soot or charcoal, carried more psychological terror than any blade or bullet. Popularized by Robert Louis Stevenson's Treasure Island, where Billy Bones trembles at its sight, the black spot blurred the line between pirate folklore and brutal reality. Whether historical fact or embellished legend, its power lay in the unshakable belief that once marked, a man's fate was sealed by the invisible hand of pirate justice. The ritual's mechanics were deceptively simple. A condemned crewmate would be handed the spot, often with a cryptic message like "Judgment comes with the tide," or a nail piercing the center to signify the inevitability of execution. Some accounts describe the spot as cut from a Bible page, adding sacrilege to the sentence. but its true terror came from the silence surrounding it. Unlike a shouted accusation or a public trial, the black spot was a quiet sentence delivered in shadows. A man might find it slipped into his rum ration, tucked into his sea bag, or pressed into his palm during a midnight watch. The message was clear: his own brethren had turned against him, and the sea would soon claim another soul. Historical evidence of the black spot is frustratingly scarce. Most records come from second-hand tales or fictionalized accounts. Yet its plausibility hinges on how perfectly it suited pirate psychology. Unlike naval courts with their pompous tribunals, pirate justice was swift, decentralized, and deeply superstitious. A crew might tolerate theft or cowardice for weeks, but once consensus turned against a man, the black spot served as both verdict and execution order. The condemned wasn't just being killed, he was being erased, his name struck from the ship's informal ledger of trust. The superstition's genius was its flexibility. In some versions, receiving the spot granted a final chance. The condemned could fight for his life in a duel or attempt some impossible feat to redeem himself. Other tales insist the spot was irreversible, its curse clinging like tar even if the man escaped. The Wider's logs mention a sailor named Elias who jumped ship after receiving the spot, only to wash ashore days later with a blackened piece of driftwood clutched in his hand. Whether coincidence or staged horror, the story spread through pirate ports, reinforcing the spot's mythic finality. What's chilling is how the black spot mirrored broader maritime fears. Sailors already believed in omens like the Albatross or phantom ships. This was simply those forces weaponized by human hands. By framing executions as fate rather than mere punishment, pirates absolved themselves of guilt. After all, if the sea demanded a life, who were they to refuse? Even captains weren't immune. Edward Blackbeard Teach allegedly received a spot, though likely fabricated by rivals, while Charles Vane's crew reportedly used one to depose him before marooning him on a barren quay. The black spot's legacy lingers in phrases like marked man and death warrant, but its deeper lesson is about the power of belief. Pirates, for all their lawlessness, thrived on shared rituals codes that bound them together even as they plundered. The spot wasn't just a death sentence, it was a dark sacrament, a reminder that in a world without courts or prisons, superstition could be the sharpest blade of all. And perhaps that's why Stevenson immortalized it, not because it was certainly real, but because it felt real to men who knew the sea's justice was as arbitrary as the wind. The ocean's most enchanting danger wasn't hidden beneath waves. It was the siren song of the mermaid, a melody so beautiful it could steer ships straight into the jaws of jagged rocks. Sailors whispered of these half-women, half-fish creatures with equal parts longing and terror, their voices weaving through fog like a spider's silk, drawing men toward doom. But behind these fantastical tales lay something far more human. The crushing isolation of life at sea, where months without sight of land could twist a manatee's silhouette into a seductive phantom, or make the creak of rigging sound like a woman's lament. Christopher Columbus himself stoked the myth, writing in his logs about spotting mermaids near Haiti in 1493, though he noted they were not as pretty as they are painted. Modern scholars believe he'd actually seen manatees, their rounded forms and paddle-like limbs vaguely humanoid from a distance, but the legend predates Columbus by millennia. Assyrian myths told of Atargates, a goddess who cast herself into the sea and took the form of a fish, while West African folklore warned of Mami Wata, a water spirit who dragged unfaithful lovers to the depths. The mermaid wasn't just a creature, she was a universal metaphor for the sea's dual nature, alluring yet deadly, promising companionship but delivering oblivion. The psychological grip of these stories became terrifyingly real in maritime disasters. After the Dutch merchant ship Lindenberg wrecked off South Africa in 1782, survivors claimed they'd followed a woman singing through the storm. Only later did they admit the song was likely wind whistling through fractured masts. Similarly, logs from the whaler Dolphin describe a crewman leaping overboard near the Azores, screaming that a mermaid was beckoning him home. His shipmates saw only empty waves. Such accounts reveal how deprivation warped perception. Vitamin A deficiency from poor diets could cause hallucinations, while the constant drone of the sea became a blank canvas for desperate minds to populate with fantasies. Yet the mermaid's curse wasn't just about mistaken identity. She embodied sailors' deepest guilt. Many seafarers left families behind for years, and the mermaid's song was said to mimic the voices of wives or mothers. In this light, the myth becomes a haunting projection. Men who'd abandoned loved ones now feared being lured to their deaths by those very voices. Even pirate codes often included odd clauses about lying with mermaids, punishable by marooning. Was this mere superstition or a twisted safeguard against the temptations of shore leave? The legacy of these beliefs lingers in maritime law. As recently as 1912, British courts accepted mermaid-induced delirium as a defense for a fisherman who jettisoned his catch, claiming the creatures had cursed his nets. And modern sailors still report eerie singing in remote stretches of ocean, now attributed to underwater acoustics or rare whale vocalizations. But perhaps the most telling evidence lies in figureheads. Those carved women gracing ships' prows weren't just decorations. They were talismans meant to charm the real mermaids into safe passage. After all, if you couldn't escape the sea's illusions, you might as well try to bargain with them. What makes the mermaid myth endure isn't its plausibility, but its poetry. The ocean doesn't need monsters to be deadly. Its storms and currents suffice. Yet humans have always needed stories to explain why we're drawn to things that destroy us. The mermaid was the perfect scapegoat, a creature who made the sea's indifference feel personal, even romantic. Because it's easier to blame a siren song than admit the waves don't care if you live or die. And in that truth, the real curse reveals itself, not in mythical fish women, but in the human heart's refusal to sail uncharted waters without a story to cling to. Long before the Bermuda Triangle became synonymous with vanishing ships, sailors whispered of another cursed stretch of ocean, the Devil's Sea, a watery graveyard off the coast of Japan where compass needles spun wildly and vessels disappeared without even a splinter to mark their passing. This wasn't just superstition, it was a collective dread carved from centuries of vanished junks and ghostly derelicts found drifting with no crew, their decks eerily intact. The Pacific's answer to the Bermuda Triangle, the Devil's Sea, formed part of a sinister network sailors called the Vile Vortices, zones where the laws of navigation seemed to unravel like rotten rigging. What made these places so feared wasn't just the disappearances, but the sheer impossibility of them. Logs from the 1800s describe ships like the Rio Unmaru, a Japanese schooner that vanished in 1887, only to reappear weeks later. Its holds empty, but its sails still billowing as if propelled by invisible hands. Other accounts tell of compasses reversing polarity, stars appearing in the wrong positions, and sudden fogs that swallowed ships mid-voyage. Scientists now attribute many cases to methane hydrates erupting from the seabed or magnetic anomalies, but to ancient mariners, these were places where the veil between worlds grew thin. The Devil's Sea earned its name not just for its dangers, but for the chilling sense that something or someone was tampering with reality itself. The parallels to the Bermuda Triangle are striking, but the Devil's Sea predates Western fascination by centuries. Chinese and Japanese sailors avoided it as rigorously as medieval merchants steered clear of dragon-marked territories on maps. Fishermen spoke of yumabazu, giant black humanoid figures rising from calm waters to capsize boats, a folkloric explanation for rogue waves that could snap a ship in half. Even Japan's Imperial Navy treated the zone with caution. Records from the 1600s reveal shoguns were routing entire fleets after astrologers warned of malignant currents in the area. Unlike the Bermuda Triangle, which gained notoriety through 20th century pulp magazines, the Devil's Sea's terror was organic, passed down through generations of sailors who'd seen its whims firsthand. Yet these cursed zones served a paradoxical purpose. They gave shape to the unknown. By marking "Here be dragons" on their mental maps, sailors created boundaries for the unexplainable. The Devil's Sea wasn't just a hazard. It was a story, a way to make sense of the sea's randomness. When the Kayo Maru, a research vessel, vanished there in 1952 with 31 scientists aboard, newspapers didn't blame methane bubbles or faulty equipment. They invoked centuries of accumulated myth. The ocean's true terror wasn't its monsters, but its indifference, and superstitions like these were life rafts for the human mind. Modern shipping lanes still skirt the Devil's Sea's edges, not out of fear but habit. Satellite navigation has demystified its waters, yet the stories persist because some truths are deeper than facts. These vortices remind us that every age has its edges, its places where the maps end and the legends begin. And perhaps that's why they fascinate us still, not as warnings but as mirrors, reflecting our timeless urge to name the unnameable and fence off the infinite. The sea doesn't need curses to be dangerous, but for those who sail it, a little darkness makes the vastness easier to bear. There's something chillingly poetic about a sailor slipping a silver coin between his teeth before battle, not as treasure but as toll. This ancient ritual, borrowed from Greek myth, turned every man into his own funeral director, carrying payment for the ferryman of the dead right in his mouth. The logic was grimly practical. If the sea claimed you, Charon wouldn't wait for your crewmates to rifle your pockets. Your passage to the afterlife had to be clenched between your jaws, ready the moment the waves pulled you under. The myth of Charon was no abstraction to Mediterranean sailors. In Greek lore, the scowling boatman demanded an obol, a small silver coin, to shuttle souls across the river Styx. Fail to pay, and you'd wander the shores for 100 years. For men who faced drowning daily, this wasn't folklore, it was a contingency plan. Archaeological digs of shipwrecks have turned up skeletons with coins nestled in their teeth, some so tightly wedged they survived centuries underwater. The Marsala Punic ship, sunk off Sicily in the 3rd century B.C., held the remains of a Carthaginian sailor with a silver drachma still pressed to his palate, as if he'd bitten down in his final moments. But the ritual wasn't just about death, it was a psychological armor against it. By carrying their own ferry fee, sailors transformed paralyzing terror into a strange kind of control. Viking crews adapted the practice, placing coins or small amulets in their mouths before storms, whispering prayers to Njord, god of the sea winds. Chinese junks sailing the South China Sea used brass cash coins with square holes, symbolizing the union of earth and sky even in the belly of the ocean. The details varied, but the message was universal. The sea might take your body, but your soul would negotiate its own passage. The darkest twist, some captains weaponized the superstition. During the Napoleonic Wars, British naval officers reportedly issued coins to recruits before battles, not just as payment for Charon, but as a morale booster. "The Navy provides your fare to heaven, lads," went the grim joke. It was a macabre pep talk reminding men that even in death, their service would be acknowledged. Pirate crews, ever the contrarians, flipped the script. Blackbeard's men allegedly plundered Spanish silver pesos not for spending, but for dying, preferring to meet the ferryman with stolen wealth clenched in their teeth. What's haunting is how the ritual outlasted its origins. Even after Christianity spread across Europe, sailors clung to the coin tradition, repurposing it as St. Peter's fee, or stuffing coins into the knots of burial shrouds. The Merry Rose, Henry VIII's flagship, yielded several crewmen with coins in their mouths when raised in 1982, proof that 500 years of progress hadn't erased primal fears. Modern divers still occasionally find skeletal jaws guarding their silver cargo, a mute testament to the lengths humans will go to tame the unknown. The brilliance of this superstition lay in its duality. That tiny disc of metal was both surrender and defiance, an admission that the sea always had the upper hand, but also a refusal to let death strip you of your last dignity. Today, we might call it trauma preparedness, but to those sailors, it was simply common sense. When you work in a realm where the line between breathing and drowning is as thin as a coin's edge, you learn to hedge your bets. And if that means keeping your afterlife fare tucked in your cheek like a piece of hard candy, well, better safe than spectral. The captain's table was more than a place to eat. It was a mirror reflecting the brutal mathematics of life at sea. Among its polished plates and flickering lanterns, one chair always sat empty, its untouched cutlery gleaming in the dim light. This wasn't an oversight, it was a silent prophecy. Known as the dead man's chair, this vacant seat served as a constant reminder that the next meal could be the captain's last, or any crewman's. To sit in it accidentally was to invite gasps, even from hardened sailors. The ocean played no favorites, and that empty chair was its sobering RSVP to every dinner. This superstition wasn't just morbid theater, it was a psychological anchor. Naval logs from the 1700s reveal captains who refused to let anyone, even visiting dignitaries, disturb the chair's eerie vacancy. Admiral Horatio Nelson's fleet famously kept the tradition, with officers noting how the untouched place setting seemed to sharpen the crew's focus during storms. The message was clear: death dined with them nightly, and only discipline could keep it at bay. Whalers took it further, leaving a full meal at the empty seat during night watches, as if appeasing some unseen guest. When the food remained untouched by dawn, they'd exhale safe for another day. But the ritual's roots ran deeper than mere remembrance. In Celtic maritime lore, the empty chair was a literal invitation, a seat left for the Anku, a skeletal figure who collected souls lost at sea. To sit there was to risk catching his attention. Pirates, ever the pragmatists, twisted the superstition. Black Bart Roberts' crew reportedly forced condemned men to eat their last meal in the dead man's chair, turning the omen into a verdict. The chair became a stage for power plays, a way to unsettle rivals without drawing a cutlass. Archaeology hints at how widespread the fear was. Excavations of the Merry Rose revealed a peculiar dining arrangement near the captain's quarters. A single stool positioned apart from the others, its surface worn smooth from anxious hands gripping its edges. Even submarines in World War II adapted the tradition, with U-boat crews leaving an empty spot at their cramped tables. The context had changed, but the dread remained. The sea's appetite was endless, and that chair was its placeholder. What's haunting is how the empty seat served opposite purposes, both warning and ward. Some captains believed it functioned like a lightning rod, drawing death's gaze away from the living. Others saw it as a challenge, a dare to the universe to fill it. The duality captures the sailor's eternal dance with fate. Prepare for the worst, but never stop defying it. Modern cruise ships sometimes nod to the tradition with symbolic memory tables for lost passengers, but the original terror is gone. After all, when you're floating atop miles of abyss, sometimes the most terrifying thing isn't the monster below, but the empty space beside you, waiting to be claimed. Before gunpowder dominated naval warfare, sailors waged battles with something far more intimate: the written word, carved in stone and hurled like a grenade of ill intent. The cursing stone was more than a superstitious projectile. It was one of history's first psychological weapons, a fusion of primal magic and battlefield strategy. Picture this: as two ships closed in for combat, crews would frantically etch insults, threats, or outright hexes onto smooth stones, sometimes in blood, sometimes with the tip of a knife, before hurling them onto the enemy deck. The goal wasn't to crack skulls, but morale. A well-aimed curse could unravel a crew's courage faster than cannon smoke. The practice traces back to the ancient Mediterranean, where Phoenician and Greek sailors believed words held tangible power, especially when sealed with ritual. A stone inscribed with "Poseidon drag you down" wasn't just a taunt, it was a prayer for divine intervention. Viking longships carried nithstang stones, pillars carved with runic curses, to hurl onto enemy shores before raids. These weren't empty gestures. Archaeological digs near Old Norse harbors have uncovered stones etched with phrases like, "May your sails rot and your men go blind," their runes still legible after 1,000 years. The sheer specificity of the curses suggests genuine belief that the right combination of symbols could summon storms, sour fresh water, or turn allies against each other. But the genius of cursing stones lay in their duality. Even skeptical crews used them, recognizing their psychological sting. Naval logs from the 1500s describe Spanish galleon crews descending into paranoia after finding Gaelic curses scattered on their decks during clashes with Irish privateers. One account tells of a cook who refused to prepare food, convinced a stone marked, "Your belly will swell with worms," had poisoned the galley. The fear was contagious enough to make seasoned fighters hesitate at critical moments. Pirates like Blackbeard exploited this, reportedly stockpiling pre-carved stones to lob onto merchant ships before boarding, turning superstition into a tactical advantage. The ritual's effectiveness hinged on atmosphere. Imagine the scene: waves crashing, timbers groaning, and then thud, a smooth rock skitters across your deck. You pick it up, squinting at the jagged letters in flickering lantern light. Even if you didn't believe in curses, the act of reading the words planted doubt. And at sea, doubt could be deadlier than any blade. The British Admiralty took it seriously enough to ban the practice among its fleets in 1621, calling it unchristian and unnerving to men of good sense. Yet merchant ships and pirates flouted the rule for centuries, proving that sometimes the oldest weapons cut the deepest. What's fascinating is how cursing stones bridged the sacred and the strategic. Some included symbols from multiple religions across here, a Mjolnir there as if hedging spiritual bets. Others were carved with tiny sailboats or drowning men, visual aids to reinforce the terror. A few recovered stones even bear nail marks, suggesting they were ritually killed to activate their malice, much like ancient curse tablets buried in temples. This wasn't mere vandalism, it was performance art designed to haunt. Modern naval warfare may rely on drones and sonar, but the instinct to weaponize fear remains. The cursing stone's legacy lives on in propaganda leaflets dropped by armies or cyber attacks that leave taunting messages on hacked systems. The mediums change, but the principle endures. Words can wound when amplified by context. And perhaps that's why these stones still captivate us, not as relics of primitive thinking, but as proof that human psychology hasn't sailed as far from shore as we'd like to think. After all, even today, the right words in the wrong moment can sink a ship. On the razor's edge between day and night, when the sun kissed the horizon and the sky held its breath, sailors watched for a miracle, a fleeting emerald spark known as the green flash. This sliver of otherworldly light, lasting barely a second, wasn't just a trick of the atmosphere. To men who'd spent months staring at endless blue, it was a celestial wink, a promise from the heavens that luck hadn't abandoned them. Spotting it required perfect conditions, clear skies, a flat horizon, and eyes sharp enough to catch magic in motion. But for those who did, the reward was more than visual. It was spiritual armor against the sea's cruelty. The science behind the green flash is as precise as it is poetic. As sunlight bends through Earth's atmosphere, its colors scatter like paint tossed in water. Blue and violet wavelengths usually diffuse into the sky, but under just the right circumstances, the last sliver of the sun fractures into a vivid green, a phenomenon caused by the same prism effect that creates rainbows. Ancient sailors knew nothing of refractive indices, but they didn't need to. What mattered was the pattern. Crews who witnessed the flash often made port safely, while those who missed it seemed to face disproportionate misfortune. Correlation became causation in the minds of men who craved order in chaos. Records from the age of exploration brim with green flash lore. Ferdinand Magellan's chronicler, Pigafetta, wrote of a green flame seen off Patagonia before a providential wind saved their starving fleet. Whalers in the 1800s swore the flash appeared brightest before their most bountiful hunts, while pirates like Henry Morgan allegedly delayed raids until the Omens showed proof that even cutthroats bowed to nature's signals. The superstition grew so potent that some captains kept flash watchers aboard, men with a knack for spotting the phenomenon. Their warnings could halt a voyage start or speed its course, all based on a gleam no wider than a knife's edge. Yet the green flash's power wasn't just in its rarity, it was in its timing. Appearing at sunset, it marked the threshold between the known and the unknown, a moment when the world seemed to pause. For sailors, this was liminal space ripe for omens. Polynesian navigators interpreted it as Taroa, the creator god, brushing the waves with his fingertips. Mediterranean traders saw it as Venus blessing their cargo, and for Norse crews it echoed the emerald glow of Bifrost, the bridge to Asgard, as if the gods were reminding them they sailed under divine gaze. The green flash's legacy lingers in modern maritime slang. A flasher still refers to someone with preternatural luck, and naval cadets sometimes toast the horizon at sunset, half in jest, half in hope. Science may have demystified the phenomenon, but not its emotional weight, because for all our satellites and radars, the sea remains a place where logic falters and instinct thrives. And sometimes, against all odds, the sky still winks back. To alter a ship's name was to spit in the face of the gods, or so ancient sailors believed. This wasn't just superstition, it was a fundamental law of the sea, as unchanging as the tides. A vessel's name carried its identity, its soul, and to strip that away invited chaos. Mariners whispered of renamed ships that turned rogue, as if the ghosts of their past lives clung to the hull, steering them toward rocks or summoning storms out of clear skies. Even today, seasoned sailors hesitate before scrubbing off a name, as if the paint itself holds some ancient pact with the ocean. The roots of this taboo stretch back to the earliest seafaring cultures. The Phoenicians, master traders of the ancient Mediterranean, believed a ship's name was whispered to the gods at launch, a sacred contract. To change it was to break that vow, inviting divine retribution. Norse sagas tell of longships cursed after their owners renamed them without proper rituals, their crews doomed to wander the waves as spectral draugar. Even the Romans, pragmatic as they were, held elaborate ceremonies to purify a ship before granting it a new name, often involving animal sacrifices and libations poured over the prow. The message was clear: the sea remembered, and it demanded respect. Historical records brim with cautionary tales. The Mary Celeste, famously found adrift in 1872 with no crew, had been renamed 3 times before her final, ill-fated voyage, a fact later seized upon as explanation for her eerie fate. Whalers in the 1800s refused to board vessels with freshly painted names, convinced they carried the stink of bad luck. One particularly infamous case involved the HMS Friday, a British naval ship renamed in defiance of superstition. Though it served without incident, crews avoided mentioning its name in port, referring to it only as "that ship" in hushed tones. But why such dread? Part of it was practical. Ships developed reputations, and a new name might hide a dark history. A vessel once used for slaving or smuggling, its very timbers steeped in suffering. Renaming could also confuse port officials and merchants, leading to legal tangles. Yet the deeper fear was spiritual. Sailors saw ships as living entities, their personalities shaped by every storm weathered and every port visited. To erase that history was to create a stranger, an unknown quantity in an already unpredictable world. Modern maritime culture still tiptoes around this tradition. Yacht owners who rename their vessels often perform denaming ceremonies, reciting verses to placate the sea gods before christening the ship anew. Commercial fleets might skip the rituals, but even they admit to unease. Container ships with rebranded logos sometimes develop odd mechanical issues, fueling whispered theories about grudges in the steel. Science chalks it up to coincidence, but sailors know better. The ocean has a long memory, and some debts can't be painted over. What makes this superstition endure isn't logic, but the weight of collective experience. In a realm where control is illusory, rituals offer anchors. A ship's name isn't just a label, it's a story, a chain linking every sailor who's ever served aboard. To sever that chain is to risk becoming unmoored, not just from tradition, but from the invisible threads that bind every vessel to the sea's capricious will. And in those depths, some truths don't need proof. They just need to be believed. A crimson tide rolling toward your ship wasn't just a spectacle, it was a portent written in blood. When the ocean turned red, sailors didn't see a natural phenomenon. They saw a warning etched across the waves, a divine signal that violence or catastrophe lurked just beyond the horizon. This primal terror transcended cultures and centuries, from Mediterranean galleys to Chinese junks, weaving together biblical dread and battlefield intuition into a single unshakable truth: red waters demanded retreat. The association between scarlet seas and impending doom wasn't arbitrary. Ancient mariners knew too well the 2 most common causes of such discoloration: algae blooms and sediment from distant battles. The first could poison entire fisheries, starving ports into famine. The second often meant upstream slaughter had stained the currents, a grim herald of war's approach. Phoenician traders navigating the Nile Delta would turn their ships at the first hint of rust-colored water, convinced the shade came from clashing armies farther inland. Viking sagas spoke of Fafnir's tide, a crimson swirl said to appear before raids, named for the dragon whose blood supposedly seeped into the sea whenever death was near. But the fear ran deeper than practical observation. The Bible's Book of Exodus, a text known even to illiterate sailors through oral tradition, described the Nile turning to blood as the first plague upon Egypt. For Christian and Jewish crews, a Red Sea wasn't just ominous, it was apocalyptic. Spanish Armada logs from 1588 describe panic spreading through the fleet when parts of the English Channel glowed reddish-brown after heavy rains, with crews refusing to drink collected rainwater, certain it was tainted by divine wrath. Similar hysterics struck Ming Dynasty sailors when monsoon runoff turned the Pearl River estuary scarlet. They abandoned their cargoes of porcelain, believing the gods had rejected their offerings. The psychological impact of this superstition shaped history. In 1623, Dutch merchant ships fleeing Batavia, modern Jakarta, reported a sea of blood off Java, likely a massive algal bloom. Their abrupt course change away from the phenomenon led them straight into a waiting British blockade, altering the balance of power in the Spice Wars. Centuries later, during the American Revolution, a Continental Navy captain ordered a retreat after spotting reddish water near the Delaware Bay, fearing it signaled a British ambush upstream. The ambush turned out to be iron-rich clay runoff, but the legend grew, reinforcing the taboo. Science now explains these scarlet swaths, noctiluca algae, sediment from laterite soils, even blooms of krill, but the old dread lingers in maritime slang. Modern sailors still speak of war water when encountering unusual hues, and naval strategists note how rarely battles occur near algal blooms, if only because both sides instinctively avoid them. There's a dark poetry to that, a superstition born from millennia of spilled blood and poisoned tides still steering human conflict long after its origins faded into myth. The ocean never needed curses to be dangerous, but when it flushes red, even the most rational mind hesitates. After all, some warnings are written in a language older than reason. The sight of a ship gliding silently through the waves' sails, billowing with no hand to steer them, decks empty of life, was enough to freeze the blood of even the most hardened sailors. These phantom vessels, known as ghost ships, weren't just eerie anomalies. They were omens of the highest order, floating tombstones warning of curses, plagues, or worse. From the Mary Celeste, found drifting near the Azores with her crew vanished without a trace, to the Japanese Ryo Unmaru discovered adrift over a century after her disappearance, these silent specters became the stuff of maritime nightmares, their very existence defying logic and stoking primal fears. But what made these encounters so chilling wasn't just the absence of crew, it was the unnatural preservation of the ships themselves. Logs from the 1800s describe vessels with tables still set for meals, lanterns swinging as if recently lit, and even steaming cups of tea left undisturbed. The Carroll A. Deering, a schooner found stranded off North Carolina in 1921, had her lifeboats meticulously stowed, her sails neatly trimmed, and not a soul aboard. It was as if the sea had plucked the humans away mid-breath, leaving only hollow echoes of their presence. Sailors whispered that these ships weren't abandoned, they'd been claimed, their crews taken by forces too terrible to name. The superstitions surrounding ghost ships often mirrored the anxieties of their eras. Medieval Europeans blamed the Flying Dutchman on divine punishment, while Caribbean pirates suspected voodoo curses or siren abductions. In Japan, the Yurei Fune phantom vessels manned by skeletal crews were said to appear before tsunamis, their tattered sails heralding coming disaster. Even science flirted with the supernatural. When the SS Valentia wrecked off British Columbia in 1906, survivors swore they saw a ghostly replica of their own doomed ship moments before the collision, a phenomenon later attributed to atmospheric refraction, but no explanation could erase the terror of that omen. Archaeology reveals how deeply these legends permeated maritime culture. Excavated ship logs show crews altering course at the faintest glimpse of a derelict, sometimes adding weeks to their journeys to avoid haunted waters. Whalers in the 1800s carried charms made from whalebone to ward off ship-stealing spirits, while naval captains ordered extra watches posted after sightings, fearing contagion. The irony, many ghost ships were likely victims of mundane tragedies: carbon monoxide poisoning from faulty coal stoves, rogue waves sweeping crews overboard, or even mutinies gone awry. But in the vast, indifferent ocean where reality bent like light on the horizon, the mundane rarely satisfied the need for meaning. The legacy of these specters lingers in modern maritime lore. The International Maritime Organization still classifies unidentified derelict vessels as navigational hazards, and salvage crews approach them with a caution that borders on ritual. Even today, when satellites map every square mile of ocean, ghost ships materialize like the MV Alta, a cargo vessel found drifting unmanned off Ireland in 2020, her wheelhouse littered with personal effects. Technology strips away none of the unease. If anything, it amplifies the mystery, because in an age of radar and GPS, the sea still keeps its oldest secrets. And somewhere in the rolling fog between the known and the unknowable, the silent ships sail on. A single copper nail driven deep into a ship's keel wasn't just craftsmanship, it was a whispered pact between sailor and sea, a fusion of metallurgy and mysticism that spanned centuries. Shipbuilders from the Baltic to the Caribbean swore by this ritual, embedding the nail where hull met ocean, believing its reddish gleam could repel lightning storms and ward off the insidious creep of rot. But this wasn't mere superstition. It was ancient science dressed in legend's clothing, a testament to how closely observation and faith intertwined in the age of sail. The logic behind the copper nail was deceptively clever. Long before humans understood conductivity, they noticed lightning rarely struck copper-clad objects, a phenomenon later explained by the metal's ability to dissipate electrical charge. Vikings, whose longships frequently braved North Atlantic squalls, lined their keels with copper rivets, dubbing them Thor's teeth after the god of thunder. Mediterranean shipwrights took it further, hammering nails near masts, the tallest points on their galleys, as makeshift lightning rods. Even pirates, notorious for cutting corners, spared no expense when it came to these nails. Blackbeard's Queen Anne's Revenge was found with over a dozen copper spikes driven into her hull, their positions too deliberate to be accidental. Yet the nail's power didn't stop at weather. Copper's antimicrobial properties, unknown to ancient cultures but empirically proven, made it a secret weapon against shipworm and rot. Spanish treasure galleons sailing the tropics often carried extra nails to replace iron ones eaten by brine, noting how copper-fastened planks stayed stubbornly intact. Whalers in the 1800s reported fewer outbreaks of ship fever, likely fungal infections on vessels with copper-rich fittings. Over time, these observations crystallized into lore. A copper nail wasn't just a fastener, it was a talisman against decay, its very presence somehow purifying the wood around it. The ritual of driving the nail became its own sacred theater. Norse builders soaked the nails in seawater for a full lunar cycle to awaken them, while Chinese junks required a master carpenter to strike the final blow, his hammer blows counting out an auspicious number, usually 8, the numeral of prosperity. British naval ships reserved the task for a vessel's youngest crew member, symbolizing the ship's future resilience. And woe to the shipwright who skipped the step. Logs from the Dutch East India Company describe the Groot Beer sinking in 1683, with survivors blaming its lack of copper nagels for attracting a fatal lightning strike. Archaeology confirms how widespread the practice was. The Vasa, Sweden's ill-fated warship, had copper nails spaced precisely every third plank, a pattern mirrored in the wreck of the Batavia off Australia. Even the Titanic, for all its modern engineering, carried copper rivets in key structural points, a nod to tradition hidden beneath its steel hull. Today, modern yachtsmen still occasionally press copper coins into their keels during construction, less out of belief than habit, though few complain when their GPS fails during a storm and old instincts kick in. What makes this superstition endure isn't just its practicality, but its poetry. That humble nail embodied the sailor's eternal dilemma, how to bargain with forces far beyond human scale. The sea didn't care about mortal ingenuity, but maybe, just maybe, it would respect a gleaming sliver of metal, driven deep with equal parts hope and defiance. And sometimes, against all odds, the lightning would miss, the rot would retreat, and the nail would gleam like a tiny victory in the dark. When the night sky swallowed all bearings and the sea stretched black in every direction, one point remained constant: Polaris, the North Star, burning steady above the Earth's axis like a celestial lighthouse. For ancient mariners, this wasn't just a navigational tool, it was a divine anchor, a fixed point in the chaos that sailors prayed to as fervently as they did to any saint or god. To lose sight of it was to lose your soul's compass, drifting not just physically but spiritually into the void. The star's unwavering position made it more than a guide. It became a covenant between sailor and cosmos, a promise that no matter how far the waves carried you, something in the universe held firm. This reverence wasn't arbitrary. Unlike other stars that wheeled across the sky with the seasons, Polaris hung nearly motionless, its constancy a miracle to cultures who saw the heavens as alive and capricious. Viking navigators called it Lathas Jonah, the leading star, and whispered runic prayers into their fists before uncurling their fingers to check its alignment. Arab traders navigating the Indian Ocean timed their voyages by its height above the horizon, believing its light carried the blessings of Allah's order. Even the Greeks, who mapped the constellations with scholarly precision, left offerings to Artemis on nights when Polaris burned brightest, conflating the goddess of the hunt with this hunter of lost ships. But the North Star's true power lay in its fragility as a lifeline. Cloud cover, storms, or simply sailing too far south could erase it from the sky, a catastrophe scribbled in panicked margins of ships' logs. The Santa Maria, Columbus's flagship, nearly foundered off Cuba when overcast skies hid Polaris for days, leaving crews convinced they'd angered the heavens. Whalers in the 1800s described the terror of star-blind nights in the Arctic, where ice fog swallowed the sky, and men groped for direction like the blind. Some Inuit guides carried pieces of phosphorescent fungus to mimic the star's glow during blizzards, a desperate pantomime to calm hysterical crews. Rituals grew around this celestial dependency. Polynesian navigators, though they relied more on star paths than a single marker, still saluted Polaris when crossing the Equator, acknowledging its sovereignty in the north. European captains kept star charts not just for navigation but as sacred texts, their margins scrawled with pleas like Stella Maris, Misera Nobis, Star of the Sea, have mercy on us. Pirate ships, otherwise lawless, often spared the lives of astronomers, valuing their ability to read Polaris's height as a measure of latitude. Blackbeard himself reportedly spared a Jesuit stargazer during a raid, snarling, "A man who knows the fixed star is worth 10 who know the cutlass." The star's mystique even shaped maritime technology. The earliest astrolabes and cross-staffs were calibrated specifically to measure Polaris's angle, their brass scales etched with prayers as well as degrees. Ships carried star knives, blades with notched edges to gauge the star's height, that doubled as ritual objects passed down through generations like family Bibles. When John Harrison invented the marine chronometer in the 18th century, solving longitude's riddle, old-school navigators resisted, distrusting any tool that diminished Polaris's role. They'd spent centuries decoding its whispers. A clock couldn't replace covenant. Yet the North Star's greatest lesson wasn't in navigation but psychology. In a world where storms could erase coasts and compasses spun wildly near magnetic poles, Polaris was the one thing that never lied. Its constancy taught sailors that some truths endure beyond the tumult, a metaphor not lost on poets and captains alike. When Admiral Peary finally reached the North Pole in 1909, he didn't plant a flag in the ice. He scribbled a note to Polaris itself, as if reporting to a commanding officer. The star had guided him there. It only seemed right to give thanks. Modern GPS has rendered celestial navigation obsolete, but Polaris hasn't faded from maritime consciousness. Naval academies still teach its use as backup, and astronauts training for moon missions learn to spot it as a homing beacon. The star endures as both tool and talisman, a reminder that even in our age of satellites, humanity still looks up, searching for fixed points in the darkness. Because the sea hasn't changed, it still demands humility, still swallows the unprepared. And on a clear night, when the waves quiet and the wind stills, you'll still find sailors on deck, necks craned, whispering to that unwavering light as if it were listening. Pirate gold had a way of slipping through fingers, not just because of its weight, but because of the whispers that clung to it like salt to a ship's deck. Across every ocean, from the Caribbean to the South China Sea, treasure wasn't just wealth, it was a test. Stories spread of chests that drove men to slit their own throats, jewels that glowed with unnatural fire, and coins stamped with faces that changed expression in moonlight. These weren't just campfire tales, they were psychological warfare, cautionary myths designed to do what shackles and swords couldn't, keep stolen riches from being stolen again. Take the infamous Aztec blood gold of Captain Francois Elolonais. After sacking Maracaibo in 1667, his crew hauled back chests of golden idols, only to find their ship plagued by nightmares. Men woke screaming of jaguars with human eyes, and by dawn, 3 had vanished overboard. Elolonais himself would later be captured and reportedly eaten by tribesmen, a fate sailors swore was the gold's vengeance. The truth, more likely the work of toxic mercury fumes from improperly refined ore, or even deliberate poisoning by Spanish defenders who'd coated treasures with arsenic. But superstition needed no lab reports. The message was clear. Some plunder came with invisible chains, yet curses weren't just accidents, they were branding. Pirates like Henry Morgan deliberately seeded rumors about haunted loot to deter rivals. A captured Spanish galleon's log from 1692 describes how Morgan's men staged an elaborate ruse. They left a single chest of silver in plain view on a deserted quay, its lid carved with symbols later identified as nonsense Mayan. When a rival crew took it, Morgan's spies spread word that the carving summoned the drowning god. Within months, 3 ships that had touched the silver met disaster. 1 burned, 1 sank in calm seas, and the third's crew went mad, allegedly gnawing the rigging like rabid dogs. Coincidence, almost certainly, but in an era without forensics, pattern-seeking minds filled the gaps with doom. The most chilling accounts come from the East India Company's archives. After seizing a pirate vessel near Madras in 1721, British officers inventoried a trove of Mughal emeralds, only to record that every man who handled them suffered visions of hanging. 7 weeks later, the ship's entire marine contingent was dead from dysentery. The emeralds lost in a storm, though some swore they'd been thrown overboard by a terrified lieutenant. Modern gemologists suggest the stones might have been coated in hallucinogenic plant resins used as adhesives, but to those sailors, the lesson was simpler. The sea claims its dues, and treasure is just its bait. Archaeology confirms how deeply these beliefs ran. Excavations of pirate hideouts like Isla de la Juventud reveal caches of gold deliberately buried with warding objects' mirrors facing downward. rusted nails arranged in pentagrams, even dried bats pinned to corkboards. These weren't random acts, they were spiritual insurance attempts to balance the scales after theft. One recovered journal from a buccaneer named Jacques Lefebvre describes melting down cursed coins to make bullets, believing gunfire would purify the metal. It didn't save him. He was hanged in Port Royal with those very bullets in his pistol. The brilliance of these curses lay in their flexibility, a crewman going mad from lead poisoning. The Gold's fault, a ship sinking from shoddy repairs, divine punishment. Even mundane misfortunes became proof of supernatural justice. And perhaps that was the point, not to explain the unexplainable, but to enforce order in a lawless world. When every man on board was a potential thief, superstition became the only law everyone feared. Today, treasure hunters still whisper about the Tear of Tlaloc, a stolen Aztec sapphire said to summon hurricanes, or the Dutchman's peril, a chest of silver pesos that surfaced in diver logs for centuries, always accompanied by fatalities. Most dismiss it as folklore until they're alone in deep water, their flashlight glinting off something round and metallic in the silt. Then, for a heartbeat, even skeptics remember, the sea keeps what it takes, and some prices aren't paid in gold. Burial at sea wasn't just a practicality, it was a sacred transaction, a delicate negotiation between the living and the restless dead. When a sailor's body slid into the depths, wrapped in canvas and weighted with shot, the crew wasn't just disposing of a corpse, they were performing an exorcism. Ancient mariners believed the ocean claimed souls as fiercely as it did ships, and without proper rites, the departed could claw their way back as vengeful specters, dragging storms in their wake. This wasn't folklore, it was protocol etched into maritime law and whispered in the same breath as prayers. The ritual's precision was its power. British naval manuals from the 1700s dictated every detail. The corpse's feet faced eastward for resurrection. The shroud stitches avoided red thread to prevent bleeding in the afterlife, and the final cannon salute wasn't just honor, it was a sonic ward, the blast scattering any lingering malice. Whalers took it further, sewing their dead into sails marked with whalebone crosses, a nod to both Christ and the leviathans that ruled their world. Even pirates, those anarchists of the waves, adhered to grim formality. Black Bart Roberts' crew famously paused mid-plunder to bury a fallen comrade, reading from a stolen Bible before tipping the plank. The message was clear, some lines even outlaws wouldn't cross. Archaeology reveals how deeply these fears ran. The wreck of the Merry Rose held a skeleton still clutching a rosary, likely a sailor buried abruptly as his ship sank, denied rights but clinging to faith. In contrast, the Vassa's preserved corpses were found neatly grouped, suggesting a rushed yet orderly committal as the warship listed. These weren't careless disposals, they were desperate acts of spiritual hygiene, attempts to quarantine death's contagion. Yet the terror of improper burial wasn't just about ghosts, it was about guilt. Sailors who'd watched mates die of scurvy or falls often blamed themselves for surviving. The funeral ritual cleansed the living as much as the dead, offering absolution through ceremony. Naval logs describe crews weeping not from grief but relief as the weighted body vanished beneath the waves. The sea became both grave and confessional, swallowing sins along with the slain. Modern navies still perform sea burials, though now they're more tradition than talisman. But when a storm rises unexpectedly or sonar picks up a shadow where no wreck should be, even the most rational sailor might glance at the waves and wonder, was the bargain truly honored? Or does something down there still remember the taste of unfinished business? Superstitions didn't just haunt sailors' dreams, they steered empires. When the Spanish Armada set sail in 1588, its commanders didn't just consult maps and weather reports, they agonized over the alignment of planets and the omens in their breakfast entrails. A single sighting of a devil bird, likely an exhausted seagull, could delay fleets for days, giving enemy forces precious time to regroup. These weren't quirks of ignorant men. They were calculated risks in an era when the line between divine favor and disaster was razor-thin. The result, naval strategies that look bizarre to modern eyes but made perfect sense in a world where the supernatural was as real as the waves. Take the Viking raids on England. Norse sagas reveal that longships often waited for the death moon, a lunar eclipse, before attacking, believing the darkened sky would hide their approach and weaken their enemies' resolve. Historical records from monasteries like Lindisfarne describe panicked monks witnessing ships materialize under the eerie red glow of eclipsed moonlight, their oars muffled by wool wrappings to avoid waking the sea spirits. What seemed like tactical brilliance attacking under cover of celestial events was actually superstition in action. The Vikings didn't just exploit the darkness, they weaponized their enemies' terror of it. Trade routes bent to these beliefs too. The ancient Phoenicians, master navigators of the Mediterranean, refused to sail west of Gibraltar for centuries, convinced the pillars marked the edge of the world where sea monsters lurked. This fear gifted their rivals, the Greeks, uncontested access to Atlantic trade until Carthaginian explorer Hanno finally broke the taboo in the 5th century B.C., revealing vast new territories. Even Columbus's voyage was shaped by omens. His crew's mutiny wasn't just about dwindling supplies, but their terror at crossing into the Sea of Darkness, where medieval maps warned of boiling water and magnetic rocks that would pull nails from ships. Ship designs carried superstitions in their very timbers. Chinese junks featured eye-shaped carvings on their prows, not just for decoration but to see hidden reefs and ward off the evil eye. British naval ships until the 1800s had witch marks, crisscrossed grooves carved into their beams to trap malicious spirits. The infamous Vasa, Sweden's top-heavy warship, sank minutes into her maiden voyage partly because her builders ignored a shipwright's warning about unlucky knots in the timber. The king had demanded launch on an astrologically auspicious date, overriding practical concerns. The result, a sunk flagship and a crippled navy. Perhaps the starkest example lies in the Anglo-Dutch Wars. Dutch admirals, steeped in Calvinist pragmatism, dismissed weather omens as papist nonsense until a series of devastating storms decimated their fleets, while the English, who delayed sailing based on astrological advice, stayed safe in port. The Dutch East India Company soon hired its own stargazers, proving even the most rational minds bowed to tradition when the sea demanded it. Superstitions weren't just stories. They were survival strategies honed by generations of watching the ocean reward ritual and punish arrogance. The legacy of these beliefs lingers in surprising ways. Modern shipping lanes still curve around ancient, cursed zones like the Devil's Sea, not out of fear but habit, a ghost of psychology shaping geography. Even the U.S. Navy's tradition of commissioning ships with smashed champagne bottles echoes pagan rituals of offering spirits a first taste to avoid jealousy. The ocean hasn't changed, only our illusions of controlling it have. And in that gap between knowledge and mystery, the old fears still whisper, reminding us that history isn't just shaped by cannons and compasses, but by the unshakable human need to find patterns in the chaos. From whistling bands to ghost ships, these 30 superstitions weren't just quirks of the past, they were the lifeblood of maritime survival, etched into every decision from launch to battle to burial. Imagine standing on the deck of an 18th century warship, the wood groaning beneath your feet, the horizon endless and indifferent. Without weather forecasts or emergency beacons, sailors clung to rituals like lifelines, transforming every whistle, every coin, every glance at the sky into a whispered negotiation with forces far beyond human control. These beliefs weren't born from ignorance, but from generations of watching the sea reward caution and punish arrogance in equal measure. What's striking isn't just the variety of these superstitions, but their universality. Cultures separated by oceans, Vikings, Polynesians, Phoenicians all developed eerily similar taboos. Don't whistle up a storm, don't sail on Fridays, never harm an albatross. This wasn't coincidence, it was collective wisdom hard-earned through shipwrecks and vanished crews. The red sky at morning, the banana curse, the copper nail in the keel, each one a coded lesson passed down like a map to navigate not just the waves, but the fragile human psyche adrift in their vastness. Yet these rituals also reveal something profound about how we cope with the unknown. When the Merry Celeste was found eerily empty, or when the Flying Dutchman shimmered in the fog, sailors didn't turn to science, they turned to story. The sea doesn't give answers, so they crafted their own. Phantom ships for vanished crews, mermaids for lonely nights, cursed gold to explain greed's consequences. These myths weren't escapes from reality, they were tools to face it. A captain who banned whistling wasn't just avoiding storms, he was reinforcing discipline. A crew that buried coins in the mast wasn't just praying, they were investing in morale as much as divine favor. The legacy of these superstitions lingers not in modern navigation charts, but in the way we still personify the sea. Ships are still she, storms are wrathful, and luck is something you earn. The ocean hasn't changed, only our illusions of controlling it have. So the next time you hear a sailor knock on wood or refuse to set sail on the 13th, remember, you're witnessing an unbroken chain of survival logic stretching back to the first humans who dared to leave shore. Which of these ancient beliefs resonated or unsettled you the most? Was it the haunting logic of the dead man's chair or the primal terror of the red tide? Drop your thoughts below, and if you've enjoyed this voyage into history's shadowy currents, don't forget to subscribe. The past is full of uncharted depths, and we're just getting started. Until next time, keep your coins close, your whistles silent, and your eyes on the horizon. The sea remembers its old tricks, and so should we.